right, I'm Alan Stiles. I think most of you know who I am. And you didn't come here to listen to me. So I'm going to ask Sister Betsy, our national president, to introduce our guest tonight.
Thanks, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with you all. Nice to see you. We did bring 2 carloads up from DC, so this happened to coincide with our Ag Day celebration. So we have our outstanding young patrons, Gail and Autumn, and our junior ambassador Nettie with us, and some staff members. So good to be here. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker tonight, Jeff Winton. We have had a connection with him and his group for, a year?
Yeah,
almost. Year plus. I lose track of time. His passion, his mission just fits with the Grange. We're a family organization, and families look out for each other. And I'm sure Jeff will tell you his story. I won't go into that. Let him tell you. He tells it very passionately, and you can see as soon as we heard him, we said the Grange has to get involved with this organization. So we're hoping that it spreads across the country. He attended our national convention last year, and he lives very near Niagara Falls, so he'll be there this year. He's a dairy farmer. He has another business. He has horses. He has dogs. I don't know how he fits everything he does into a 24-hour day. So, Jeff, come up and tell us your story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betsy, and thank you, Alan. I'm not sure if I really need this, but we'll start with it. So it's a privilege to be here with all of you tonight. I left our farm up on Lake Erie this morning a little later than I wanted because we had a broken manure spreader, and then the manure chain went out. We are in the middle of snow country, so it's very cold, and we had 2 feet of snow when I left this morning. So it was kind of nice to get down here and see not only grass, but it's like really starting to turn green now. So we're probably 2 months away from that happening up there. But all I can say is anyone coming to Niagara Falls for the national meeting, make sure you bring warm clothing, because mid-November it could be a little cool. But anyone who does come up from this area, the drive that I took, which I had never done before, from where my farm is on Lake Erie down here is one of the most beautiful drives I think I've ever taken anywhere. I always thought that the Blue Ridge Mountains were beautiful, and they are. But driving down through the Allegheny Mountains and everything on a beautiful sunny day like today was just a real treat. So hopefully if anyone drives up there, it's an easy drive and it's a very picturesque drive. So I really appreciate spending a few minutes with you tonight, and I'm just going to talk, and certainly it's a very informal conversation, and anyone that has questions throughout the discussion, please raise your hand. I don't have slides tonight. I do have a slide presentation I use sometimes, but I find that smaller meetings like this sometimes are better served just having a discussion, because what I'm going to be sharing with you is really the story of my family and why I'm standing in front of you and why Rural Minds was founded only a year and a half ago. So as Betsy said, we started partnering with the Grange shortly after we were founded. But the family event that happened took place 13 years ago. So I'd like to share my family story with you and then talk a bit about what we're doing with Rural Minds and where the Grange and our Growing Hope Together program currently is. So my family story as it relates to this particular topic started on September 1st, 2012. And my family is a family like many families, I'm sure in this area, who have been in farming for many generations. I'm the 8th generation dairy farmer. The farm has moved a couple times, including from Pennsylvania, but where we currently farm has been in the family now for 5 generations. And my oldest nephew, his name is Todd Jr., was married on September 1st, 2012. And it was a beautiful upstate New York autumn day. The winters can be difficult up there, but the falls are absolutely gorgeous. The leaves are what you think of with New England, and I'm sure not very much like Rhode Island are. And the sun was out. We had gotten the hay in. The corn was looking good, so everybody was feeling pretty good about what lied ahead. And so my nephew was married at the little country church, and a lot of the neighboring farm families were there, and it was just a really wonderful time. My mom was turning 75 2 days later, so a number of the people that came in town for the wedding were there also for my mom's big birthday party. So we celebrated my nephew and his new wife. And then the next day, I started at 5 in the morning, and at that point we had 3 different farms. So I started at the home farm, did what I needed to do there, and then went and visited the other 2 dairy farms. And I stopped at the family cemetery, where several generations of my family is buried and where I more than likely will be buried. And my nephew Brooks, who is the second oldest in the family and the brother of my nephew who had just gotten married, he and I had this thing where whoever was at the family cemetery would take a selfie to show the other person what the flowers were looking like, if the caretaker was taking good care of it. And so we had this little routine, and Brooks was like a brother to me. My oldest brother, his father, lives with bipolar disorder and substance use disorder. And so he wasn't necessarily capable of raising his 3 children. So my mom and dad, who were both alive at that time, raised their 3 grandkids, but they were more like children to them. So in turn, they were more like brothers and sisters to me and to my siblings. So I stopped at the cemetery, took a selfie, and normally Brooks, being of the age he was at that time, was always on his phone. And I would normally get a response right away. And I didn't hear from him, and I thought, well, maybe he's sleeping, maybe he's working. I didn't think too much of it. So I left the cemetery, and he literally lived a mile from the family cemetery. My family all lives within 15, 20 minutes of each other. And as I approach his house, I see fire trucks and police cars and ambulances and sirens, and I knew something very bad had happened. So I pull up, I jump out of my truck. Of course, I've been doing farm chores all day, so you can imagine what I looked like. And I jumped out, and the woman who lived across the street come running over, sobbing hysterically, and grabbed me and said, "Don't go any further." And I'm like, "Renelle, what happened?" And she said, "I just found your nephew in the backyard, and he's dead." And he, at that point, was a very healthy 28-year-old guy. He worked on our farm part-time. He also worked at the local steel mill. He had 3-year-old twins who he adored. He was in the process of buying a house. Very exuberant, very happy-go-lucky guy who had more friends than all the rest of the family combined. And so I assumed that he had had an accident, he had had a heart attack, something had happened, and come to find out he had died by suicide. And obviously it was a shocking situation for all of us, but what was especially surprising was that he was the last person in our family that we would have ever expected it, because he always seemed happy. He always had so many friends around. He always seemed to be the life of the party. His sister, who was a dairy farmer in Wisconsin, had attempted suicide a number of times, unsuccessfully, thankfully. So we were all focused on her, that no one expected that Brooks would be the one that we would be then planning a funeral for. So my family went from planning and executing a wonderful wedding to 2 days later now planning and executing a funeral. And so my father had passed away at that point. My mom was still alive again. She turned 75 that day. She was 75 the day he died. That's the day her party was supposed to be. And we went to the little United Methodist Church nearby where we worshiped, and we're sitting in the study of the pastor. And the pastor said, "So what do you want to say? What do you plan on doing?" And, you know, even though that seems like an innocent question, the reason he asked it is because in our little farming community of 500 people, we had a lot of people, including other family members, who said we shouldn't tell what really happened. We should say he died in a farming accident. We should say he died of a heart attack. We should make up something because no one wanted to admit that someone died by suicide, especially someone in my family. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. And that's a big part of what we're focused on with Rural Minds. And my mom was one of the most gentle, quiet, yet strong women you'd ever want to meet. And she was always kind of in the background, raised 4 boys, worked on the farm. But that day, when the pastor asked her that question, she pounded her fist on the desk with tears coming down her face and said, "Pastor, we're not only going to talk about it, we're going to talk about it in detail." She said, "Enough is enough. This has to stop. There have been too many deaths in this community that no one's been talking about. And everyone knows what happened, but no one will admit it." So I was asked to give the eulogy at Brooks's funeral, and it wasn't an easy thing to do, as you can imagine. And because he was so young and had so many friends, the little country church was packed. And at the end of my eulogy, where I did go into quite a bit of detail, at least as much detail as we knew, at the end of it, we had a number of people waiting to not only, of course, extend their condolences to us, but to tell their story to us. They finally felt that they had the opportunity and the privilege and probably the obligation to start talking about this. And some of these families are people that I had grown up with, that we had known, and you know, we knew that they had unexplained deaths in the family, but nobody ever talked about it. So the floodgates opened that day, and I think because my family had been up in this area for so long, and because, again, it was all my mother. I was just the messenger. It was my mother who said we have to do something. Because of her strength and her courage, other families finally felt like it was time that they needed to start confronting this and talking about it. And so that was really the beginning that planted the seed for Rural Minds, the organization that I represent. When I'm not doing dairy farming work, I also work in the healthcare industry. So I've had the good fortune of working for a number of biopharmaceutical companies over the years, including companies that work in the mental health space. So I knew something about it, but it wasn't personal at that point. Once you lose somebody to suicide, it becomes personal very quickly. And so I started to reach out to some of the other large organizations, such as Mental Health America, NAMI, some of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, groups that you've probably heard of, that have been around for a long time, that do a lot of really terrific work. And because of my day job, I knew a lot of people at these organizations. And we knew we needed to do something, but we didn't want to recreate the wheel. We didn't want to duplicate something that somebody else was already doing. So as I started having conversations with the other groups, they said, we need somebody who understands rural America. They said, we understand Washington, D.C. We understand Los Angeles. We understand Miami. We know nothing about where you're from. We know nothing about farmers or ranchers, people that live in mining communities or fishing communities. So they said, if you decide to start an organization, we will help you because we need you. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize when I speak to them about this is that 60 million people live in rural America. What's considered rural America? 1 out of every 5 people in this country live in rural America. So there were 60 million people that really didn't have access to a lot of the services that people in cities and suburbs did. And obviously those of you who are here, I assume most of you probably live in rural Maryland or Pennsylvania or wherever you're from, Rhode Island. So you know that, we have added challenges. 30% of families in rural America don't have broadband. And if you have it, it's not great. At least mine isn't great. I never know from day to day if it's going to be working or not on our farm. And our farm manager, who lives just down the road on our farm, it's not even available there. Mine is the last house it's available on. So during COVID, when his 3 kids were homeschooled, they were doing it on the hotspot on his cell phone. I went through a lot of cell phones that year. And a lot of people in rural America are also uninsured or underinsured. And so if a person is living with diabetes, for example, but they're also living with depression, if you have to make a decision between paying for your insulin or paying for your antidepressant, insulin's normally going to win. So we have been working really hard the last few years to try to put everything in place before we launched our organization. Again, in the spirit of we're in an emergency and we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, we did a lot of research to ensure that there was a need for the organization and that we could find wonderful partners like the Grange that would be, interested in what we were doing. So Rural Minds was launched in October of 2021, and even though it was at that point 9 years after my nephew died, the timing was right because people were finally starting to realize that there's this big population of people in rural areas that up until recently never really had much of a voice. A lot of times you're hidden if you're in rural areas, and those of us that live in rural areas, we tend to be maybe at times a little more inwardly focused. We're not out there, telling our story as loudly as people that live in suburbs and cities do. So we have been working again with the Grange from the very beginning, and I've had the good privilege of doing a number of these talks. I did one at the Ross Grange in New York, which is where my great-grandparents and my aunts and uncles all belonged. And I'm now, by the way, an associate member of the Grange in New York, so I haven't joined a Grange Hall yet, but I'm an associate member, which is the first step. And we had a standing room only audience that day. It was at 1:30 in the afternoon. They decided because it's a big dairy farming area, they wanted to do it in the afternoon in between chores. And plus, there's a number of elderly members of that Grange that didn't necessarily want to drive at night. But what was so astounding to me, besides the turnout we had, was that we had so many people that weren't farmers that went to work, took a late lunch at 1:30, came to our presentation, and then went back to work. We had a number of people that pulled their kids out of school to bring their children to hear the talk. And in New York, we have a partnership with a group called New York FarmNet, which is part of Cooperative Extension. And I'm not sure if Maryland or Pennsylvania has anything like this. I know Minnesota does because we're working with a group up there. But it's part of Cornell University, and it's a division of Cooperative Extension where if a farm family is in distress, you can call and they will assign 2 people, not just one, but 2 people that will come out to your farm and meet with you. One person is a financial analyst because a lot of the farms are in financial trouble. The other person is a licensed therapist. And what I found very interesting since we've been working with FarmNet is that even though a lot of the calls they get are supposedly financial in nature, when they get to the farm, they realize that it's something else. But the farm family feels more comfortable saying that we're having a financial issue than we're having an emotional issue and we need help with our depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. So what we do in New York, and they can only do this in New York, is have a therapist that comes with me, and then she will do part of the presentation and then we stay after. And she didn't even know this was going to happen last Monday, but a gentleman, he was a dairy farmer from very close to Niagara Falls, I'm sure we'll see him at the Grange meeting, had driven down in the middle of a snowstorm 2 hours to be at our meeting. And during the Q&A, he stood up and just, very emotional, and he started crying, and he said, "I just so appreciate what you folks are doing." He said, "My wife of 45 years just left me. One of my sons just died by suicide. And now my other 3 sons won't have anything to do with me because they're blaming me for everything that's happening in the family and on the farm." And he said, "I didn't know where to go." He said, "I had contemplated suicide myself." So he said, "We need a group that is out there," meaning both us and FarmNet in New York, who's speaking on our behalf, who is ensuring that people don't forget about the people that are producing our food and fiber in this country. So I know that some of the FarmNet people are very interested in the Grange, and in fact, some of them, I'm doing a meeting in 2 weeks up at in Clifton Springs, New York, and FarmNet is going to be partnering with me up there, and we're right now talking to Bert and Betsy about bringing them in to do some training at the national meeting potentially. So what we're attempting to do with Rural Minds is take a lot of the wonderful stuff that already exists, because all of these other organizations have been around for a long time, and they've done some really wonderful training sessions and produced a lot of good materials, but it hasn't really gotten in the hands of the people that we serve, the people that live in rural areas, because how you reach people in small towns many times is different than how you reach them in big cities. There's a whole ecosystem of media that's different. You say something about Ag Day to somebody living in Chicago, they don't know what you're talking about. So we've been doing a lot of work with a lot of the agricultural media. Alan Hortz Dairyman did an interview not too long ago, which was especially a thrill for me, because I told people growing up that's how we learned how to read, was with Hortz Dairyman and Judge Cows. So we're doing a lot of media outreach, but we're also doing some work inside the Beltway. Betsy, you may or may not know this, but we had Sean on a call the other day. We met with the House Ag Committee about the new Farm Bill to ensure that that is going to go further than the last Farm Bill did. The last Farm Bill talked about the opioid epidemic, which is a huge issue, especially in rural areas. But I would dare to suggest that alcohol abuse is as big in rural areas, and it became especially an issue during COVID when everyone was shut in. So we're doing what we can, and again, the Grange is much better suited in Washington than we are at this point since we're so new. But that's proving to be something where at least they're reaching out to us now, and we're starting to meet with individual members of Congress to talk about what needs to be done, both at the national level but also at the state level. Some statistics that people just find really shocking, and they're brand new. They're either from the CDC or the USDA, but the rate of suicide in rural areas from 2000 to 2020 rose almost 50%. It rose 27% in urban areas, but it rose almost 50% in rural areas. People that live in rural areas, like all of us, have a 65% greater chance of dying by suicide than people in urban areas. Farmers and ranchers are twice as likely to die by suicide than any other profession. We're doing a lot of work with veterinarians now. I don't know if any of you are aware, but it's a growing issue amongst veterinarians. A young 33-year-old vet that I know just died 2 weeks ago due to the pressure and the stress of her profession. And we're already in a shortage situation, as those of you who farm know, especially with large animal vets. And even though you get that vet bill and you think they're making a fortune, the thing that people don't realize is a lot of these vets, including a friend of mine in Minnesota, he's got $250,000 worth of college loans. He'll be paying off pretty much the rest of his career. And so while the bills may seem high, it's not necessarily the practicing vet that's making the money unless they own that practice, which isn't the case in a lot of situations anymore. And people go into veterinary work because they truly care about animals. And on a daily basis, some of these vets are euthanizing animals, which has to be a source of great sadness and stress. So we're doing a program with the vet school at Cornell. That's where I went to the ag school at Cornell. And the vet school at Cornell is very interested in this topic for obvious reasons. But just this past summer, the young man that ran the student organization, he was elected president of the Student Vet Association at Cornell, died by suicide when he was home over the summer. And so once his classmates all started coming back to school, of course, it was a really difficult situation for the dean and the administration at the vet school. In many cases, those of you who farm know that a veterinarian many times is your confidant. You're the person that you develop a relationship with, that you feel comfortable talking about all kinds of things. I know when my dad was alive, we never could get him to go to the human doctor. And he would always wait till the vet came, even if his arm was hanging off of gangrene, because he didn't trust the people doctor, but he loved the veterinarian. And what's happening now is people are starting to open up a bit. We still have a lot of work to do, but they're talking to the veterinarian, or they're talking to the artificial inseminator, or they're talking to the fieldman who's out there walking, the cornfields with you. So a number of those folks were at the presentation we did in New York last week at the Ross Grange meeting. And so what we're doing is trying to help them not only to be the ears and eyes of the community, since they're on the farms, but also to self-care, because it's a huge burden if you're the person who's listening to everyone else's issue. And if any of you have been in ministry, this is one of the reasons that people in ministry burn out, because they're always listening to everyone else's issues. And at times, they don't feel like they've got anybody that they can talk to their issues about. So we are, focused on a lot of these other associated areas. And we've started with agriculture mainly because that's my background, that's what I understand. Most of the people that work in rural mines have agricultural backgrounds. But, rural America, if there's 60 million people, there aren't 60 million farmers anymore, unfortunately. You've got miners, which is where the opioid epidemic started, probably not terribly far from here. The coal miners in West Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee and parts of Pennsylvania got injured. It's a very dangerous occupation. And the doctors prescribed opioids for them and overprescribed. And within days, they were addicted. There's a book, if you ever get a chance, called Dope Sick, and I think there was a TV series. I don't have time to watch TV, but the book is very interesting. I'm reading that right now. And, you think of opioids being in Los Angeles or a big city, but in fact, it started in rural America. And in rural America, again, we don't have the same services that other parts of the country do. 75% of the counties, for example, in rural America, don't have a psychiatrist. If my nephew had sought help, he wouldn't have been able to find one in Western New York where we farm. He would have probably needed to go to Erie, Pennsylvania, or even to Cleveland, Ohio, which is a couple hours away. And if you're working in an occupation like farming or at a steel mill or something like that, it's not like a 9-to-5 office job where you just tell your boss, I've got to take a half a day and go and get help. You can't get away. And so there's a huge shortage right now of psychiatrists, and the average age of practicing psychiatrists is older than any other specialty. The last figure I read was the average age is 75. And a lot of young people aren't going into psychiatry, unfortunately. So we do have social workers, we have people that are nurse practitioners, there are a lot of other counselors. And telemedicine, during COVID did help some people, but I always try to remind people, especially non-farming audiences, that if you don't have decent cell service or broadband, telemedicine doesn't do you any good. And as you folks know, people in rural America would rather sit down across the table and get to know somebody before you start pouring your heart out, as opposed to talking to somebody on a phone or somebody on a video screen you've never seen before that you don't have a relationship with. We have a big problem with stigma in rural America with mental illness. And we were talking before the presentation started that in many cases, mental illness still is not considered an illness. It's considered a character flaw, a personality weakness, something you should be able to just get over. We were raised to be very independent in rural America, and we're told not necessarily to always seek help, to try to figure it out on your own, right? And you can't do that with cancer, you can't do that with diabetes, you can't do that with cardiovascular disease, you certainly can't do that with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. So we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that people understand that mental illness is in fact an illness and it needs to be treated as such, and people should feel comfortable talking about it. I know it's an embarrassing topic at times, but I remember when I was growing up, people really didn't talk that much about cancer either, and I'm sure some of you remember that. You kind of whispered, oh, she has cancer. Now people talk more openly about cancer. So mental illness is this generation's cancer. And we've got an issue with these wonderful young people in this country that 1 out of 5 high school students has seriously contemplated suicide. That's 20%. And the second leading cause of death now in people 15 to 19 is suicide. The first are accidents, whether it's a vehicular accident or an accidental shooting or falling down a set of stairs or something like that. But the number 2 cause is suicide. So I was happy to hear that some of the schools are now putting programs in place. We were talking before the meeting started. We've been talking to 4-H. My first job out of college, I was a 4-H agent, so I'm a big fan of 4-H. So we've been talking to the 4-H folks as well as FFA to see if we can get them to start helping us focus on youth programs, as well as the Grange. Of course, the young people in the Grange have been very interested in this topic, and we've had the privilege of spending some time with them and hope to do even more at the meeting in Niagara Falls. Excuse my voice. So one thing that I want to make sure everyone knows is that there is help. There is plenty of help out there, but you need to seek it. You need to be ready. Not everyone is ready, and no one can force you to go and get help. But just know that there is plenty of help there. And if you go to our website, which is ruralminds.org, we've got a section of our website that has a lot of the resources by category there that we've aggregated for people. So you don't have to search all over the place, and we're continuing to add to that. Our program with the Grange, Growing Hope Together, that we launched at the meeting in Reno last year, is getting a lot of traction thanks to the Grange. I know that Oregon is getting ready to roll out a program. I've been talking to them. Chuck Strand, our executive director, did a program for the Connecticut State Grange. And the Connecticut State Grange has started a chapter with the Lions Club in Connecticut, and it's called the 988 group. And 988, by the way, is the new suicide prevention number. So if you remember nothing else after I'm done talking tonight, please remember that number, 988. If you feel like you're in a bad place or just need someone to talk to, or if someone in your family or one of your friends is having a tough time, it's replaced that long number that was around for many years. Last summer, the government rolled out 988, and that's all you have to remember, and you will get a live person who will talk to you, and they will refer you to someone in your area that can help. The other thing I always want to make sure people realize is that the pharmaceutical companies that make all the medicines we all take have programs called patient assistance programs. So if you go to a doctor and find out that your insurance doesn't cover whatever medication, and now I'm talking all diseases, not just mental illness, but if your insurance doesn't cover them, and if you fall into certain criteria, your drugs will be given to you free. And for some reason, it's not been a widely used program, but after having worked for a lot of those companies, I can tell you there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are set aside every year by the pharmaceutical industry to help people that need medicine that may not have adequate insurance. And all you need to do is find out what the medicine is that your doctor wants to prescribe, and then you go to the website of the manufacturer. Most doctors can tell you what that is. And every website will have a patient assistance program number where you can call or text them or email them, and they will help you pay for your medicine. So that's something that, I'm hoping that more people start to take advantage of, because it's money just sitting there ready to be utilized. The Grange is in a very unique position to really be a leader in this area. You've got 1,500 locations across this country, and the Grange is already considered a safe place where people gather to learn and to have fellowship and get to know each other. And that kind of camaraderie and community is so critical when you're dealing with something as serious as mental illness. And so we're hoping that more and more Granges will take this on and do programs locally. Just because I farm in New York and that's where I live, we're doing a lot of programs in New York, but I was happy on a beautiful day to drive down here today, and I've even told the folks in Oregon if they want me to come out there, I'm happy to do that. What we're doing is putting together a toolkit that various organizations can use, so that, like the presentations sometimes I give, if it's a bigger group, or if it's something that they want to invite the public to, which I'm finding more and more of the Granges are doing. They're opening it up to the public, and not only is it a nice community service to the community that particular Grange functions in, but it's also, from what I'm gathering, we're in the early days, but it's helping to revitalize some of the Granges. It's bringing people in who may not have any idea what the Grange is. That certainly was the case at Ross. I would say that probably 80% of that audience were non-Grange members. It's a very small Grange. Some of the members have been part of that Grange for many, many years, people I grew up with and admired. But they had a whole new bolus of people that got exposed to the Grange. So they did a little program on what the Grange is and other things that they do. And then they had a reception after where they invited the community to stay. A lot of people had to go back to work, as I said. But they got to meet some of the Grange members, and they were giving out quite a few applications. We'll see how many are turned back in. So I do think that this is a topic that certainly touches all of us. Even if you don't have a story like mine where you've had an immediate family member who's died by suicide, chances are you probably know somebody, or at least know somebody who struggled with mental illness. So it's something that touches all of us, and it's going to take all of us to help turn this around. But we're in a crisis situation in rural America, and I don't see it improving anytime soon, especially some of the communities that are so dependent on agriculture. Dairy farming has been like this. I mean, the price of milk is much better now than it's been, but so is the price of corn and fertilizer and feed and everything else. And rural communities are dependent on the agricultural industry because the local barber shop, the local diner, the local little shop that sells hardware and things, if farmers start to fail, then all the businesses in that area fail. And same with mining communities and fishing communities and indigenous communities. That's one thing where I farm. It's a large, not only indigenous community, but we also have a number of Amish who have moved from Pennsylvania because of real estate's a lot cheaper in New York, believe it or not. So we're getting
that too.
You are, is that right? Yeah. That's another whole topic for another night, but the Amish community has a very high rate of mental illness and other related issues. So again, 60 million people live in these communities, and we can't do everything overnight, but certainly with the help and the support of the Grange, who's been just absolutely phenomenal, we're hoping at least to start that we're getting the word out, and that's why we're doing so much media work and why we're just trying to sensitize people that, hey, you never cared about the people that live in the country until recently. What's been interesting, because of COVID, a lot of people that lived in big cities started moving out to the country. I'm sure some of you have noticed that where you live, because you can do certain jobs from anywhere now. And so a lot of these big city people get out to the country. The farm that adjoins mine was just bought by people from Brooklyn, New York. They don't know the first thing about farming. You guys remember that TV show, Green Acres? That's kind of what's going on up there, I think. But they're used to having all these services in Brooklyn, but they get up to our town of 500 and there's nothing. And so that's quite a surprise, and the dynamics are really changing in parts of rural America because of the fact that people have started leaving urban areas and are moving out to the country and then complaining because we spread manure, right? So that's really what I had to talk to you about tonight. I know it was a lot. I'm sure maybe some of you would have preferred slides, but I just like to have the opportunity to talk to people, kind of tell our story. But I'd love to hear from you. Any questions you have, any comments, anything you'd like to share, by all means, please let me know.
Anybody have any questions? I might call on my wife. Being married to me, that's enough. But we've been, last couple of weeks, we've been at our local church. We talked about it. I talked the first week and nobody said squat to me. But Kay talked the next week and we had at least 3 families come up to us afterwards and say, and talk about issues they had in their families. So, I'm that typical old farmer that keeps everything close to the vest. The weekend that I've had is really kind of brought that out, and Kay will tell you that I'm not real good at sharing and things like that. So, what's our strength as farmers and rural people is also a weakness that's kind of killing us. But I did take a few notes talking about the opioid crisis. The Grange has been involved with that, with Raleigh, especially here in Maryland. Another thing, as we've been talking about promoting this tonight, people with AA, with Alcoholics Anonymous, during COVID, not having that personal, that has really, really been a problem with them. Increased number of suicides because they didn't have that personal connection that they had. Couldn't meet, couldn't be in person. So, and the same thing a few years ago, our Medford Grange here had Bob Finn from the Veterans Group, our State Veterans Association. And he said, as far as veterans, the first 6 months after they've been out of active duty are really critical. That's when a lot of suicides among service people is the first 6 months after. The adjustment period, one of our members said, when he got out, it was like, have a nice life. but there's a lot of resources out there. I've talked to the Carroll County Health Department, the local hospital across the street. There's literature back there if you want to look at that. I've also, when I talked to the extension office, they've done a few things on mental illness, rural health. Some of that stuff's back there too. So, anybody have any questions? Anything they'd like to share with Jeff? Sure.
Hi, I'm Kay Stiles. I'm Alan's wife. The stories I shared at church last Sunday was, when I first started working for the county, I worked in the law office. One of our attorneys, who I wasn't assigned to, but he got there early as I did. And probably, I don't know, a year into my first 24 years with the county there at the law office, he attempted suicide, not once, but twice. He was later diagnosed with bipolar, and thanks to his wife and his doctor, and I think the leadership in my department, we had a great county attorney at the time, he got the help he needed. The other story I shared was at State Fair when I was showing, we had jerseys, I have to say that, that the girls weren't allowed to stay overnight on the fairgrounds, so they would bus us to Gouger. But I was lucky, my parents had this great family, friends that lived in Towson, so I got to stay there. And so I was always kid number 8. They had 7 kids, and they always made me feel like part of the family. I mean, the mom would get up in the morning, make food to take back to everybody, and Carroll County loved us, so they always came over and ate with us. So the girl that was around my age fell in love with a boy across the street, kind of like Alan and I, although he took much longer than
That was a real big street.
Yes. Because Alan and I, true story, he was my senior prom date. 35 years later, he asked me out for a second date. So, anyhow, back to the story. So, Patsy married the boy across the street. They were probably early 20s. They lived in Towson, kind of outskirts of Baltimore. She came home one night and found that he had hung himself. And he left a note and said, I love my wife, I love my family, I just can't take it anymore. They never know what it is. And so, after I shared those stories and we sat down at church, we had, like Alan said, a lot of people come up and share their stories because they said they didn't feel like they could talk about it. And I guess for me, I would say the biggest concern is what do you do? What signs do you look for with your friends? I would have never guessed the attorney. I would have never guessed, the young couple that we knew. And as Alan said, we've been through a rough weekend. Alan's nephew's been in shock trauma. And I've tried to make a point of making sure he talks about it and not bottles it up. And also his brother, who's worse than Alan. I mean, he will not talk about anything. He asks him, So, so I think this is very apropos, and I'm actually thrilled that we could be here because Michael has taken a turn for the better. Fingers crossed. Please keep saying prayers. They say it's a miracle. So I think this is really going to help a lot of people, and I think we all need to go out of our comfort zone and try to talk and help people that we see that might need help and struggling, because I know for a lot of farmers, they are not going to talk about it, they are not going to ask for help. And as spouses and friends of farmers, what do we look for, I guess is my question, because I'm not sure I would recognize the symptoms.
Thank you for sharing that. So the day after we did the Ross Grange meeting, some of us went through an 8-hour training called Mental Health First Aid. And I don't know if anyone's taken that. Probably a number of you have taken a first aid class on how to give CPR and stuff like this. But there's a class that's specific to how to look for signs. So exactly what you mentioned, Kay. And I did it in person at the local county extension office. It was really wonderful. And in person, you do a lot of role playing and stuff. But if you don't have time to take an entire 8 hours and go someplace, you can take it online as well. And there's now a version for teens. So it's mental health first aid for teens. And a number of schools are starting to put their students and their teachers through that. The one thing that they stressed, which we talk about a lot, is that none of us are professional therapists. I mean, I don't know a lot more about it than probably a lot of you do, because I'm learning, and it's something that, because of my family situation, we decided to tackle, but I never took any classes or never was trained in how to counsel someone that is going through a tough time. But mainly what people need is someone to listen to. And we can all listen. And our farm manager, who's worked for us for 14 years now, again, very stoic young guy, he called me at midnight one night, and I was out of town. And I assumed the cows were loose or something had happened on the farm, and Greg was very emotional and said Nick, his best friend who also works on the farm, had taken him off, left his wife and kids behind, and they had no idea where he was. And they were worried that he was going to harm himself. And Greg's like, we've got a search party, we're all out looking for him, but if and when we find him, and if and when we find him alive, what do we do? What do we say? And I said, Greg, all you need to do is just listen to him and let him know that you're here for him. That's all he needs. And, eventually then, and thankfully they did find him alive 2 days later. And Greg was able to get him into some counseling, which is now helping him a great deal. But, a lot of people don't feel like they have anyone that will listen to them and listen to them without judging them. And so that's what we can all do, is just be a safe place for people to come and to listen. The pastor at church on Sunday, as part of his sermon, really hit home with me. He had been a chaplain in the service and was called to a VA home to do a service for someone who had lived in that VA home for 40 years. And so he said, there was no family left. I showed up at the funeral. There was one person, and that person happened to work at the VA hospital. And he said, my first inclination was, well, why even bother doing a funeral? But he said, the fact that one person showed up, he said, they're going to get the full treatment. So he ended up doing the entire funeral in memory of the gentleman who had served our country, and with the one person who was there. And that's how I feel when we go out and do these talks. Sometimes it's a small turnout because it's an area that doesn't have a lot of people, or people that are necessarily even comfortable coming. The fact that you all showed up knowing what the topic was is a big deal, because in small towns, I always tell people, the best thing about a small town, like when a tragedy hits, like what happened to your nephew, everybody rallies around you. You have more tuna casseroles than you know what to do with. But the flip side of it is everybody knows your business, right? And so if you don't want something to be shared, or you're embarrassed about it, which you shouldn't be, before you know it, especially if your pickup truck is parked outside the local caregiver, people know. So that's one of the reasons we have the issue we have with the stigma in rural areas, is that people don't necessarily want the news to spread like wildfire. In a big city, it doesn't matter. You have millions of people. Nobody knows what you're doing or where you're going, but that's not the case in small towns. One thing I would say for those of you who are either farming or live near farms, some of the research we've seen about people that are more apt to die by suicide on farms, and some of the signs to look for. One is if it's a farm that's normally immaculate, that's well kept, and the cattle are, well kept and everything, and all of a sudden starts to look like it's in disrepair and it's not being cared for, there's a good chance that they're going through some kind of a struggle, and it could be mental illness. If it's a person who normally is in church every Sunday and very involved, and you see them at Friday night basketball games, and all of a sudden they disappear and you don't see them, chances are they're having a tough time and may need help. If a person is normally outgoing, like my nephew was, and all of a sudden start to retreat, that's a sign. And one thing I didn't share when I told you the story about my nephew, but when somebody dies by suicide in your family, there's a lot of blame. Everybody feels like it was either their fault or somebody else's fault. And I'm no different. I mean, I felt that way because my nephew at his brother's wedding reception seemed unusually quiet. And as I was leaving the reception, and he was a big guy, he was 6'8", weighed 280, And he was a preemie, by the way. When he was born 3 months early. He was a teeny little thing, but he more than made up for it. He gave me the biggest hug he's ever given me, and he then stood back from me and said, "Uncle Jeff, I just want to thank you for everything you've done for me and my family." And I think back now, he was saying goodbye to me, but he was also the kind of young man that was always grateful, that always showed his appreciation. So I didn't think much about it, but that was a sign that I guess I should have picked up on. But again, it's forever changed my family. Something like this changes your family because there was a lot of blame and a lot of people that felt guilty for not picking up on signs. But as I said, just making people aware that you're there for them, that you are there and will listen to them and not share what they share with you, that's big, and any of us can do that. And that, you will help them get help. I was dealing with a situation yesterday. A young woman I grew up with, she was the county dairy princess, which I guess they don't call dairy princess anymore. It's not the dairy ambassador, right?
Still dairy princess.
Oh, is it still here? Not in New York. They got rid because now.
The Farm Bureau is different.
Is it? Yeah. Well, young men can run now too, so they had to get rid of princess. So they're now the ambassadors. Anyway, she was the dairy princess back in the day. And she came to the presentation I did at the Ross Grange. And again, she's not affiliated with the Grange. And I hadn't seen her for a while. And she just looked so tired, and she had lost so much weight. And she was normally always had her hair done and always dressed really nicely and everything. And she just looked so tired. I think it's the best word to use. And so I got home from church on Sunday, and a mutual friend of ours called, and she said, "Have you talked to Heather?" I said, "Well, I saw her at the Ross Grange presentation." I said, I was a little worried. And she said, "Well, she just reached out to me and said she's contemplating hurting herself." And she said, "What do I do?" She said, I'm not trained. She said, and what they train you to do in the first aid class I told you about is point blank ask the person, "Are you considering killing yourself?" Not an easy question to ask anyone, but that starts the process. If you feel that there's anyone who is about to harm themselves, you ask that question. You just say, "Are you considering killing yourself?" And that will not only allow you to help them get some help fairly immediately, but in many cases, and I think in the case of our friend Heather, it started to make her think that, wow, I've really gotten to a bad place. Because she said yes. She said she had contemplated it, but she's got 2 children. And she said, I can't do it as much as I want to. I can't leave my children because I'm not sure if my husband's going to take care of them the way I do. It's a very sad situation. So, again, I just listening to her and talking to her, she texted me when I was driving down, and I told her I'd call her tonight when I was finished here. But, she now knows she's got somebody who she can talk to. And again, she knows my background. She knows that I'm not trained, but I'm trying to be sympathetic, and I care about her, and I can help her get help. So, but the first aid class I highly recommend, because they go into a whole thing on what signs to look for, and another thing is if somebody's normally really easygoing and all of a sudden starts getting violent or hostile, that's normally a sign that they have bipolar disorder, and they may not be necessarily being adherent with their medication. I have a brother who lives with bipolar disorder. Actually, it's the father of my nephew who died. When he's compliant on his medicine, you want to be around him nonstop. He's just so fun and happy and great guy. But when he goes off his medicine, you want to be in the next state because it's really ugly. And that's, one of the first signs of bipolar disorder. And that's just one of many things. Schizophrenia, I mean, again, this class goes into quite a bit of detail on a lot of these diseases, and it's geared towards people like all of us, lay people, just to make sure that, they tell you, you're not a professional, you can't treat, you can't make recommendations, but you can be the first line of assistance if somebody needs you, and, call 988 for them, or, if it's really bad, you call 911. And the woman that I partner with quite a bit in New York when we do these talks does a lot of work with frontline workers, with the police departments and the fire departments, which, the fire departments are where we are all volunteer, of course, and I'm sure they are around where most of you are from too. And so she's working with them to try to better train them on what to do if they're called to a house and there's a situation, and it tends to be something that's related to some type of a mental illness or substance use issue. So, any other questions? Yes?
I just want to tell you, about 20 years ago, my mother's brother committed suicide. Like you were saying, the same thing. Nobody wanted to talk about it. And my grandmother, at the time, his mother, nobody wanted to tell her, what happened to him. And nobody would tell her what happened or why it happened or, or how it happened or whatever. And finally, my aunt had to tell her. She said, I can't, I'm not lying to you. And she was like, well, she goes, I think I know what happened. And she guessed it, but like you say, nobody talked about it or anything. But he had ALS and he had just gotten a bad, a bad report from the doctor. I think he was going to have a feeding tube put in or something.
Yeah.
So I think that was maybe some of it. But you just don't know,
Right.
It's like you say, you just don't know. So.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think also, people in rural America tend to be involved in communities of faith, and depending on the community of faith you belong to, there are some religions that consider it a sin to die by suicide. And that's why I think, again, some people choose not to tell the truth because they don't want their neighbors thinking that they're going to go to hell because their son died. So, and the whole thing, we now doing what we're doing, we're learning all new language and everything, but even the term committed suicide, I don't know if any of you knew this, I didn't know this until I took the first aid class, but the reason they say committed suicide is it was considered a crime if you died by suicide or attempted to die by suicide. And that's where the word committed came from. Just like you committed murder, you committed larceny, it was considered a crime and you could be arrested if you lived. Of course, if you're dead, it's kind of academic. So we've got a lot of work to do. We're as I said, in an emergency situation, but the good news is folks like you, spent time with us tonight coming out, listening to a topic that's not easy to talk about, but it's gonna take everybody to really turn this around and make sure that your generation, who tends to talk more about difficult topics than my generation does, it's really the young people that are the hopes here, because a lot of the things that were stigmatized in my generation, you guys talk about pretty openly. So thank you for doing what you're doing, and I hope that another generation, when this Grange meets, we won't have to have a discussion on this, that it's looked upon just like cancer or something else is. So I'll be around, especially I see there's a cake, so I'm not going to tell you. But it's been very nice being with all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight. And I've got some cards with me, and I've also got a couple handouts I'll put on the table back there. One is one we did in conjunction with the National Grange, our Growing Hope Together. And the other one is a sheet we did in conjunction with Mental Health America. So I'll put both of those out there, and please feel free to pick those up, as well as one of my cards. And our website, there's a lot of good information on there, including the Grange program. But if any of you want to contact me directly, My card has my personal email on it. Please do that. Okay? Thank you all.